We tend to imagine the ocean as something familiar, a vast but ultimately understandable space filled with movement, colour and life that behaves in ways we can recognise. From above, it looks complete. Satellites trace its surface with precision, ships cross it in straight lines, and maps render it as uniform blue expanse that feels almost simple compared to the complexity of land. It gives the impression that what lies beneath is just more of the same, an extension of the world we already know, only wetter, deeper, and perhaps a little darker. But that impression depends entirely on staying at the surface. Everything we associate with the ocean, coral reefs, schools of fish, sunlight cutting through clear water, predators chasing prey in bursts of speed, exists within a thin, fragile layer at the very top. This upper region, where sunlight penetrates and photosynthesis can occur, is where nearly all of the ocean's visible activity is concentrated. It is the part we film, the part we explore, the part we understand. It is also an incredibly small fraction of the whole. Beneath it, the ocean does not continue in the way we expect. It changes. The transition is not dramatic at first. There is no clear boundary, no line you cross where everything suddenly becomes unrecognisable. Instead, the familiar world begins to thin out. Light fades gradually, colours lose their intensity, movement becomes less frequent. The deeper you go, the less the environment resembles anything we instinctively associate with life. What replaces it is not emptiness, but something far more difficult to interpret. The ocean is not a single environment. It is a vertical world made of layers, each one governed by different physical conditions, different constraints, and different forms of life. These layers are not just variations of the same system. They are fundamentally different ecosystems stacked on top of one another, separated not by distance in the horizontal sense, but by depth, pressure, temperature, and light. And most of those layers exist beyond what we have ever truly seen. It is often said that we have explored more of space than we have of our own oceans. While that statement is sometimes simplified, the underlying truth is difficult to ignore. We have mapped the surfaces of distant planets with greater clarity than large portions of the seafloor. We have sent probes beyond the edges of the solar system, yet much of what lies beneath the ocean's surface remains inferred rather than directly observed. This is not because the ocean is too far away. It is because it resists being seen. On land, distance is the primary obstacle. In the ocean, it is pressure. Every 10 meters of depth adds another layer of force, another increment of weight pressing down from above. At the surface, this force is negligible, balanced, and invisible. But as depth increases, it accumulates relentlessly, shaping everything it touches. Light, our most reliable tool for understanding the world, disappears quickly in water. Within the first few hundred meters, most of the visible spectrum is absorbed. Reds vanish first, followed by oranges and yellows until only blue remains. Then even that fades, leaving behind a darkness that is not simply the absence of light, but a complete removal of visual reference. Without light, vision becomes irrelevant. Without vision, many of the assumptions we make about life begin to break down. Temperature drops as well, stabilizing near freezing in the deeper layers. Movement slows, chemical processes shift, energy becomes scarce. The entire system transitions from one driven by abundance to one defined by limitation. And yet, despite these constraints, or perhaps because of them, life does not disappear. It adapts. The deeper layers of the ocean are not empty. They are occupied by organisms that have evolved under conditions so different from the surface that their forms, behaviours, and biological processes can feel almost unfamiliar. These are not simply variations of surface creatures. They are the result of entirely different evolutionary pressures, and shaped by darkness, pressure, and scarcity over millions of years. To to understand them, it is not enough to imagine going deeper in the same world. It requires recognizing that the world itself is changing. The surface ocean gives us a misleading sense of completeness. It is bright, active, and densely populated. It suggests that life thrives through movement, competition, and constant interaction. But as depth increases, that model begins to fail. Speed becomes less important. Visibility disappears. Energy is no longer abundant enough to support constant activity. What emerges instead is a system built on efficiency, patience, and adaptation to extremes. The deeper you go, the less life behaves in ways we expect. Familiar patterns dissolve, new ones take their place. Creatures begin to rely on senses other than sight. Bodies change shape. Strategies for survival shift away from pursuit and toward waiting, toward conserving energy rather than expending it. And all of this exists beneath a surface that appears calm, uniform, and fully understood. This is what makes the ocean deceptive. It hides its complexity not by being distant, but by being layered. Each layer conceals the one below it, creating the illusion that what we see at the top is representative of the whole. But it is not. It is only the beginning. As the descent continues, as light weakens and the surface world recedes, the first real transformation begins to take shape. It does not arrive as a sudden revelation, but as a gradual shift, almost imperceptible at first, in the way life responds to its environment. The ocean starts to lose something essential, and what replaces it will redefine everything that follows. At first, the change is easy to miss. The water still carries light, still holds movement, still feels connected to the world above. But something begins to thin, almost imperceptibly, as if the ocean is quietly withdrawing a resource it no longer intends to provide. Colours start to dull, reds fade first, disappearing entirely within just a few meters, followed by oranges and yellows, until the world settles into shades of blue that grow deeper and more muted with every meter downward. It feels less like entering darkness and more like watching the surface world slowly dissolve, piece by piece, into something more limited, more restrained. This is the beginning of the first real boundary, not marked by depth alone, but by the loss of something fundamental. Sunlight that can still sustain life. For as long as light penetrates the water, even faintly, photosynthesis remains possible. Microscopic plants, phytoplankton drifting near the surface, continue to convert light into energy, forming the base of the ocean's entire food system. Nearly every creature in the upper ocean depends on this process, directly or indirectly. Fish eat smaller organisms that feed on plankton, predators eat those fish, and the entire structure builds upward from a single, quiet interaction between light and life. But as depth increases, that foundation begins to collapse. Somewhere between 200 and 300 meters, the last usable sunlight fades beyond the point where photosynthesis can function. The exact depth shifts depending on water clarity and location, but the effect is always the same. The energy source that supports the visible ocean simply stops. And yet, the water itself continues, but unchanged in appearance, giving no immediate signal that something essential has been removed. What follows is not an abrupt end, but a transformation. Without photosynthesis, no new energy is produced within this layer. There are no plants, no algae, no direct conversion of light into life. Everything that exists here must rely on what comes from above. Food becomes something that drifts, something that falls, something that arrives rather than grows. This subtle shift redefines the entire ecosystem. Near the surface, life is generated continuously. Here, it is inherited. Particles of organic material, fragments of dead organisms, microscopic waste, all begin a slow descent from the upper layers, forming what scientists call marine snow. It is not snow in the ordinary sense, but the comparison holds, and tiny flakes of biological debris drifting downward through the water column, accumulating slowly, unevenly, unpredictably. For the creatures that live at these depths, this falling material is not incidental. It is survival itself. The further you descend, the more sparse it becomes, the more irregular, the more uncertain. But here, in this transitional zone, there is still enough to sustain a fragile balance. Life adapts quickly to this new reality. Creatures that once relied on sight begin to adjust. Eyes grow larger, more sensitive, capable of capturing the faintest traces of remaining light. Bodies become more efficient, conserving energy rather than expending it. Movement changes. Instead of constant activity, there are periods of stillness, waiting, conserving, responding only when necessary. It is not yet alien. But it's no longer familiar. One of the most remarkable adaptations begins to emerge here, not as a static trait, but as a behavior. Every day, as the surface darkens and night spreads across the ocean, billions of organisms begin to move. Tiny crustaceans, fish, squid, and countless other species rise upward from these depths toward the surface, feeding under the cover of darkness where visibility is reduced and predators are less effective. Then, as daylight returns, they descend again, retreating back into the dim layers below. This daily movement, known as vertical migration, is the largest synchronized movement of life on Earth, yet it happens almost entirely out of sight. It is driven by the very boundary we are passing through, the line where light fades but has not yet fully disappeared. Above it, visibility brings danger. Below it, darkness brings safety, but less food. These creatures exist between those conditions, moving constantly between risk and necessity, navigating a world defined not by geography, but by light itself. The presence of this migration reveals something deeper about the ocean. It is not just layered physically, but behaviorally. Entire ecosystems shift position depending on time of day, rising and falling through the water column in response to changes in light. This creates a dynamic system where the boundaries between layers are not fixed, but fluid, shaped by cycles rather than static conditions. And yet, even as this movement continues, the downward trend remains unavoidable. Light continues to weaken. The blue tones darken further. Shadows deepen into something more complete. Eventually, even the most sensitive eyes begin to lose their advantage. Vision becomes less reliable, less useful, less central to survival. At this point, something important begins to change. The ocean is no longer a place where life is built around seeing and being seen. It becomes a place where other senses begin to take over, where detection relies on vibration, chemical traces, and subtle disturbances in the water. The first disappearance is not just the loss of light. It is the beginning of the loss of a way of understanding the world. Above, life is visual, immediate, reactive. Below, it becomes indirect, patient, interpretive. Creatures are no longer responding to what they see, but to what they detect, what they infer, what they sense in ways that do not require light at all. This shift is gradual, but it is decisive. Once photosynthesis ends, the ocean is no longer self-sustaining in the way it was above. It becomes dependent on processes that originate elsewhere. Energy flows downward, diminishing as it goes, setting limits on what can survive and how it can behave. The rules that governed life near the surface, abundance, visibility, speed, begin to lose relevance. New rules take their place, shaped by scarcity, darkness, and the constant need to conserve. And as the descent continues, those rules will only become more extreme, more refined, pushing life into forms and strategies that no longer resemble the world left behind. As light continues to weaken and the surface world recedes into something distant and abstract, the ocean does not settle into stillness as one might expect. Instead, it begins to move in a way that is almost impossible to observe directly. A vast, coordinated shift that unfolds every single day across the entire planet. It does not announce itself with sound or visible disturbance. There are no waves, no current strong enough to reveal what is happening. And yet, at a scale that exceeds anything on land, life begins to travel. Not horizontally, across distances we can map, but vertically, through layers of water that change the rules of existence with every meter. As the sun sets above the surface, as light fades and the ocean begins to darken from the top down, something responds far below. Creatures that have spent the entire day in deeper, dimly lit waters begin to rise. Not in small numbers, not in isolated groups, but in vast, synchronized populations. Billions of organisms, from microscopic zooplankton to small fish and squid, start moving upward together, forming what could be considered a hidden tide of life, flowing silently toward the surface. This movement is not random. It is precise, repeated, and deeply embedded in the biology of these organisms. Each individual is responding to subtle changes in light intensity, to the gradual fading of brightness that signals safety. In darkness, visibility decreases, and with it, the advantage of predators that rely on sight. The risk of being seen diminishes just enough to make the journey worthwhile, and so they rise. The scale of this migration is difficult to grasp. It is the largest daily movement of biomass on Earth, far exceeding the migrations of birds across continents or herds across plains. Yet it happens almost entirely out of sight, hidden beneath a surface that appears calm and unchanged. Sonar measurements have revealed dense layers of life moving upward at dusk, so concentrated that they were once mistaken for the seafloor itself, a false bottom that rises and falls with the time of day. This is not a single species or even a single type of organism. It is a collective behavior shared across countless forms of life, each playing a role in a system driven by the balance between feeding and survival. Near the surface, food is abundant. Phytoplankton thrive where sunlight reaches, forming the base of the food chain. For creatures living deeper down, this upper layer represents opportunity, a chance to feed on resources that do not exist below. But that opportunity comes with risk. In daylight, the surface is exposed. Predators with sharp vision patrol these waters, capable of detecting even small movements against the light filtering down. To enter that space during the day would be to become visible, to stand out against a bright background with little chance of escape. Darkness changes that equation. As night spreads across the ocean, the contrast between predator and prey begins to collapse. The surface becomes less defined, less illuminated, less controlled by vision. For a few hours, the advantage shifts, and in that window, the deep sends its inhabitants upward. Among the most abundant participants in this migration are lanternfish, small, unassuming creatures that are rarely seen but exist in staggering numbers. They possess rows of light-producing organs along their bodies, which they can use to blend into faint ambient light or communicate in the darkness. During the day, they remain at depths where light is too weak for predators to easily detect them. At night, they ascend toward the surface, feeding on plankton before returning to the safety of deeper waters by morning. Their movement is part of a larger pattern, one that includes countless other species moving in parallel, each responding to the same environmental cues. This creates a layered system of interaction, where predators follow prey upward, and larger predators follow them in turn. Squid rise alongside fish. Jelly-like organisms drift upward with the current. Even some larger predators adjust their depth, tracking this nightly shift in biomass. What emerges is not just a migration, but a vertical food web that expands and contracts with the cycle of light and darkness. It is a system in constant motion, but one that leaves almost no visible trace. For the creatures involved, this movement is not optional. It is a balance between starvation and predation, between remaining in a safer, darker environment with limited food, or entering a more dangerous zone where resources are temporarily abundant. Each night, that decision is made again, not consciously, but through evolutionary programming that has refined this behavior over millions of years. Those that rise too early risk being seen. Those that rise too late may miss the opportunity to feed. The timing must be precise, synchronized with the fading of light in a way that maximizes survival. This rhythm connects layers of the ocean that would otherwise remain separate. It transports energy downward as well as upward, as organisms feed near the surface and return to deeper waters, where they are consumed by other species, or contribute to the slow rain of organic material that sustains life below. In this way, the migration is not just movement, it is a mechanism that redistributes energy through the ocean, linking ecosystems that operate under completely different conditions. What makes this system particularly remarkable is how little of it we directly observe. It happens in darkness, across depths that are difficult to monitor continuously, involving organisms that are often too small or too diffuse to capture clearly. And yet, its effects are measurable, its patterns consistent, its scale undeniable. It is a reminder that much of the ocean's activity occurs beyond the limits of human perception, operating on rhythms that do not require visibility to function. As the descent continues, as these nightly movements repeat again and again, the importance of light becomes even more apparent, not just as a source of energy, but as a signal that shapes behavior across entire ecosystems. But there is a point ahead where even this faint connection to the surface begins to disappear entirely, where the migration no longer reaches, and where the last traces of natural light are gone. Beyond the reach of even the faintest daily migration, beyond the last upward journeys that briefly reconnect deeper life to the surface, the ocean begins to settle into a different kind of existence, one that no longer follows the patterns established above. The gradual fading of light is no longer just a change in visibility, but a transformation in how life itself is structured. The organisms here are not simply adapting to darkness as an inconvenience. They are being shaped by it at every level, from the way their bodies are built to the way they interpret their surroundings. What begins to emerge is not just a collection of unusual traits, but a consistent shift toward forms and strategies that feel increasingly disconnected from the world above. Eyes are often the first feature to change in ways that are immediately noticeable. In regions where a trace of light still exists, even if it is barely perceptible, vision remains valuable. But the quality of that light is so limited that standard visual systems are no longer sufficient. Some species develop disproportionately large eyes, expanding their ability to gather the smallest possible amount of illumination. These eyes are not designed for clarity or detail, but for sensitivity, capable of detecting faint contrasts or brief flashes that might indicate the presence of prey or predator. In certain fish, the eyes can dominate the entire head, extending upward or forward in ways that appear exaggerated, almost unnatural when compared to surface species. The barrel-eye fish is one such example, its transparent dome housing eyes that are oriented upward, scanning the dim water above for silhouettes or bioluminescent signals. It does not chase in the conventional sense, it watches, waiting for the smallest indication of movement or light that can be interpreted as opportunity. But even this strategy has limits. As depth increases further, even the most sensitive eyes lose their effectiveness. At that point, evolution begins to shift in a different direction, reducing the importance of vision altogether. In some species, eyes shrink or disappear entirely, replaced by other sensory systems that are better suited to an environment where light is no longer a reliable source of information. The lateral line system, which detects vibrations and pressure changes in the water, becomes more refined. Chemical sensing improves, allowing organisms to detect faint traces of substances released by other creatures, guiding them toward food or alerting them to danger. The world becomes less about what can be seen and more about what can be felt, what can be inferred from subtle disturbances in an otherwise still environment. Alongside these changes in perception, the structure of the body itself begins to reflect a different set of priorities. Transparency becomes a common adaptation, particularly in species that occupy the upper edges of this deeper region. By reducing pigmentation and allowing light to pass through their bodies, these organisms effectively remove themselves from visual detection. In a space where being seen can mean immediate predation, invisibility becomes one of the most effective forms of defense. Some species are so transparent that their internal organs are the only visible components, suspended within a nearly invisible frame that drifts through the water. Others combine transparency with reflective surfaces, scattering the minimal light that remains in ways that further obscure their presence. This is not camouflage in the traditional sense, blending into a background. It is the absence of a visible form altogether, a strategy that only makes sense in an environment where light is scarce and visibility is limited. At the same time, body shapes begin to diverge from the streamlined forms associated with fast movement. In a world where energy must be conserved and food is not guaranteed, efficiency takes precedence over speed. Many organisms develop softer, less rigid bodies, reducing the energy required to maintain structure under increasing pressure. Skeletons become lighter or are replaced by gelatinous tissue that can withstand compression without the need for heavy support. This gives rise to creatures that appear almost fluid in their construction, lacking the firm outlines that define surface animals. Their movements are slower, more deliberate, often relying on drifting or subtle propulsion, rather than rapid bursts of activity. These forms are not the result of excess or experimentation, but of constraint. Every aspect of their biology is shaped by the need to function in a space where resources are limited and conditions are extreme. What might appear strange or inefficient from a surface perspective is in fact a precise response to a very specific set of challenges. The deeper environment does not reward complexity for its own sake. It selects for what works under pressure, in darkness, with minimal energy input. Perhaps the most significant shift, however, is not in any single adaptation, but in the overall direction of evolution itself. Near the surface, life expands into available niches, diversifying in response to opportunity. In these deeper layers, the process feels different. It is less about expansion and more about reduction, about stripping away what is no longer useful and refining what remains. Traits that depend on light, speed, or abundant food begin to disappear. In their place, new systems emerge that are less familiar, more specialized, and often more efficient within this narrow context. Evolution here is not building upward, but narrowing inward, and focusing on survival under increasingly restrictive conditions. This is what gives the impression that life is becoming alien. It is not that these organisms are fundamentally different from those above, but that they are responding to a set of environmental pressures that diverge so sharply from surface conditions that the resulting forms no longer align with our expectations. The deeper you go, the more those expectations lose their relevance. Familiar categories begin to break down. The distinction between predator and prey becomes less obvious. Movement becomes less frequent. Visibility becomes less important. The entire system operates under a different logic, one that is consistent within itself but difficult to interpret from outside. And as the descent continues, As light finally disappears completely and pressure continues to increase, these adaptations will not only persist but intensify, leading to forms and behaviours that push even further beyond what the surface world can easily explain. At some point in the descent, the last trace of sunlight disappears completely, and with it, any remaining connection to the surface world's primary source of illumination. There is no gradual fading beyond this point, no dim glow lingering in the distance. The darkness becomes absolute, not as an absence that can be adjusted to, but as a condition that defines everything that follows. In this space, vision based on external light is no longer possible. There is nothing to reflect, nothing to illuminate, nothing to reveal form or movement in the way it exists above. And yet, this is not a world without light. It is a world where light has been redefined, taken out of the environment, and placed directly into the bodies of the organisms that live here. Bioluminescence emerges not as a rare trait, but as a dominant feature of life in the deep ocean. It is estimated that a vast majority of species at these depths are capable of producing light in some form, using chemical reactions that generate visible emissions without heat. This light is not incidental. It is not decorative or accidental. It is functional, precise, and deeply integrated into survival strategies that have evolved over millions of years in complete darkness. The mechanisms behind this ability are consistent in principle, but varied in execution. Most bioluminescent organisms rely on a reaction between a light-emitting molecule, often referred to as luciferin, and an enzyme called luciferase. When these components interact in the presence of oxygen, they produce light, typically in the blue or green spectrum, which travels most efficiently through water. Then some species produce this light internally, controlling it through specialized organs. Others host symbiotic bacteria that generate light on their behalf, maintaining colonies of these microorganisms within their bodies and regulating their output through biological structures that can open, close, or filter the emission. What matters is not just that light is produced, but how it is used. In an environment where external illumination no longer exists, the ability to create light becomes one of the most versatile tools available. It can reveal, conceal, attract, repel, and communicate, all depending on how it is deployed. For predators, light becomes a method of hunting that does not rely on movement or speed, but on deception. The anglerfish is one of the most well-known examples, though its familiarity often obscures how precise and effective its strategy actually is. Extending from its head is a modified fin ray that functions as a lure, tipped with a light-producing organ that glows in the darkness. This light is not constant. It can be adjusted, flickered, or dimmed, mimicking the appearance of small prey drifting through the water. Other organisms drawn to this signal approach what appears to be an easy meal, only to encounter a predator perfectly adapted to consume them with minimal effort. The anglerfish does not chase. It does not need to. It waits, using light as a tool to bring prey directly to it, conserving energy in a place where every expenditure must be justified. Other predators take a more active approach, using light not as bait, but as a momentary advantage. Some species are capable of producing sudden flashes, brief bursts of illumination that reveal nearby prey for just long enough to strike. In the darkness, where nothing is visible until it is close, this ability allows for rapid, targeted attacks that would otherwise be impossible. The flash itself becomes part of the hunting process, not just a way of seeing, but a way of controlling the interaction between predator and prey. Among the most specialized users of bioluminescence are the dragonfish, which possess a form of light that operates outside the range visible to most other deep-sea organisms. While the majority of bioluminescent emissions fall within the blue-green spectrum, the dragonfish can produce red light. a wavelength that does not travel as far in water and is effectively invisible to most species at these depths. This gives the dragonfish a unique advantage. It can illuminate its surroundings without revealing itself, seeing prey that cannot detect the light being used to observe them. Its eyes are adapted to detect this red wavelength, creating a private channel of visibility in an otherwise shared darkness. This is not just an adaptation. It is a shift in the balance of perception, allowing one organism to operate within a layer of reality that others cannot access. Bioluminescence is not limited to predation. It is also used as a defense, a way to avoid becoming prey in an environment where escape is often difficult. Some organisms release clouds of light into the water, creating glowing distractions that confuse predators and provide an opportunity to flee. Others use counter-illumination, where producing light along their undersides that matches the faint residual glow from above, effectively erasing their silhouette when viewed from below. This technique allows them to blend into the background, becoming invisible not by hiding in darkness, but by replicating it. Even communication takes on a different form in this environment. Patterns of light can signal readiness to mate, establish territory, or identify members of the same species. These signals are often highly specific, with timing, intensity, and pattern all playing a role in conveying information. In a space where sound travels differently and visual cues are limited, light becomes a language, one that is both efficient and adaptable to the conditions of the deep ocean. What emerges from all of this is a system where light is no longer a passive element of the environment, but an active tool shaped by the organisms that use it. It is created, controlled, and deployed with precision, filling the void left by the absence of sunlight with something far more dynamic. The darkness is not empty. It is structured by countless points of illumination, each one serving a purpose, each one part of a larger network of interactions that define life at these depths. As the descent continues, these strategies will become even more refined, more specialized, pushing the boundaries of how light can be used in a place where it no longer exists naturally. As light becomes something organisms must generate for themselves, and as every interaction begins to depend on carefully controlled signals rather than constant visibility, another shift begins to take shape, one that is less immediately visible but just as significant. It's not a change in how creatures look, but in how they behave, particularly in how they hunt. Near the surface, predation is often defined by movement. Speed, agility, pursuit, and reaction time determine success. Fish chase, dart, accelerate, and outmaneuver. The entire system is built around the idea that energy can be spent in bursts, that food is frequent enough to justify the cost of chasing it. But in the deep ocean, this assumption no longer holds. Energy is not abundant. It is scarce, unpredictable, and often separated by long intervals of absence. Every movement carries a cost that may not be recovered. In such an environment, chasing becomes a liability. The deeper you go, the less effective speed becomes as a strategy. There is no advantage in pursuing prey over long distances when the likelihood of encountering it in the first place is already low. Instead, a different approach emerges, one that prioritizes efficiency over force, patience over aggression, and precision over endurance. Predators in this environment do not dominate through strength alone. They succeed by minimizing effort, by reducing the need for movement to the absolute minimum required to capture food when it appears. One of the clearest examples of this shift can be seen in the viper fish. Its appearance suggests aggression, with long needle-like teeth that extend outward even when its mouth is closed, creating an impression of constant readiness to strike. But its strategy is not built around pursuit. It does not actively chase down prey across distances. Instead, it positions itself within the water column, often remaining nearly motionless, using subtle adjustments to maintain its place. It relies on the assumption that prey will eventually come within range, drawn by faint signals, drifting currents, or the same migration patterns that bring life upward and downward through the layers. When that moment arrives, the viperfish does not hesitate. Its jaws can open wide enough to accommodate prey nearly its own size, and its strike is rapid, efficient, and final. The energy spent is minimal compared to what would be required to chase the same prey over distance. It is a strategy built on timing rather than speed, on waiting rather than searching. The fangtooth operates under similar principles, though its appearance pushes even further into extremes. It possesses some of the largest teeth relative to body size of any known fish, so large that its mouth cannot fully close without specialized adaptations that allow the teeth to fit into pockets in its skull. This is not an exaggeration of form for intimidation. It is a functional design, enabling the fangtooth to secure prey in an environment where missed opportunities may not be replaced quickly. Like the viperfish, it does not expend energy in long pursuits. It relies on encounters that are brief and decisive, where the margin for error is reduced through physical design rather than repeated attempts. The gulper eel presents a different variation on the same underlying principle. Its body is elongated with a tail that tapers into a thin whip-like extension, but its most distinctive feature is its mouth, which can expand to an extraordinary size relative to the rest of its body. This expansion is not used for active hunting in the traditional sense. It does not chase or corner prey. Instead, it allows the eel to engulf whatever it encounters, taking advantage of rare opportunities without the need to evaluate or select. In an environment where food is infrequent, the ability to consume large or unexpected items becomes a significant advantage. The gulper eel does not need to be selective. It needs to be capable of taking in whatever is available when the moment arises. Across these examples, a consistent pattern emerges. Predators are not optimized for dominance through force or speed, but for success through conservation and readiness. They are built to endure long periods without food, to remain in positions where encounters are possible, and to act with precision when those encounters occur. This approach extends beyond individual species and reflects a broader shift in how predation functions in the deep ocean. The relationship between predator and prey becomes less about direct confrontation and more about probability. Encounters are rarer, less predictable, and often dependent on external factors such as drifting currents or vertical migrations. As a result, the strategies that succeed are those that reduce uncertainty, that increase the likelihood of capturing prey when it appears, rather than increasing the frequency of encounters through active searching. This has implications not only for behavior, but for the structure of the ecosystem itself. Movement decreases overall, energy flows more slowly, interactions are less frequent but often more decisive. A single successful capture may sustain an organism for extended periods, reducing the need for constant activity. Failure, on the other hand, carries greater consequences, as missed opportunities may not be replaced quickly. In this context, efficiency becomes the defining measure of success. Strength, in the sense of raw power or speed, is less relevant if it cannot be sustained. What matters is the ability to operate within the limits imposed by the environment, to extract maximum benefit from minimal input, to align behavior with the constraints of scarcity. This is not a reduction in capability but a refinement, and predators in the deep ocean are not less effective than those near the surface. They are adapted to a different set of conditions, where the rules of engagement have been rewritten by darkness, pressure, and the uneven distribution of energy. As the descent continues, these principles will extend further, influencing not only how creatures hunt, but how their bodies are structured, how they move, and how they interact with an environment that continues to push life into forms that no longer resemble anything familiar. As movement slows and hunting becomes a matter of timing rather than pursuit, another force begins to assert itself more clearly, one that has been present from the very beginning but now becomes impossible to ignore. Pressure, unlike darkness or scarcity, does not arrive as a gradual absence or a shifting condition. It accumulates with exact precision, increasing steadily with every meter of descent, pressing down with a weight that cannot be seen, only endured. At the surface, it is something we rarely consider. The human body is adapted to it, balanced against it, unaware of its presence because it is constant and manageable. But as depth increases, that balance disappears. Every 10 meters adds another atmosphere of pressure, another layer of force compressing everything beneath it. Then by the time the ocean reaches depths of several thousand meters, the weight above is immense, equivalent to thousands of tons pressing down on every square meter. This is not a condition that can be ignored or compensated for through behavior alone. It shapes the very structure of life, determining what can exist and how it must be built. In the earlier layers, adaptations focused on light, energy, and movement. Here, the challenge becomes more fundamental. It is no longer about how to find food or avoid predators, but about how to remain intact at a molecular level. Pressure affects every component of a living organism, from the largest structures down to the smallest interactions between molecules. It compresses spaces that are normally stable, alters the way proteins fold, and disrupts the delicate balance required for biochemical reactions to occur. Proteins, which are responsible for nearly all functions within a cell, rely on specific shapes to operate correctly. These shapes are maintained by weak bonds that can be easily disturbed under extreme pressure. When those bonds are altered, the protein may lose its ability to function, effectively breaking the processes that sustain life. In most surface organisms, this would be catastrophic. Enzymes would fail, cellular processes would collapse, and the organism would not survive. But in the deep ocean, life has found ways to stabilize these structures, not by resisting pressure directly, but by adapting at a chemical level. Certain compounds, known as piecelites, accumulate within the cells of deep-sea organisms, helping to maintain protein structure under compression. These molecules do not eliminate the effects of pressure, but they counterbalance them, allowing biological processes to continue in conditions that would otherwise be destructive. This adaptation is not visible in the way that large eyes or unusual body shapes are. It operates beneath the surface, within the chemistry of the organism itself, ensuring that the fundamental mechanisms of life remain functional despite the surrounding environment. At the same time, larger structures must also adapt. Bones, which provide support and protection in many surface animals, become less practical under extreme pressure. Rigid structures can be a disadvantage, as they create points of resistance that are more susceptible to damage when subjected to constant compression. As a result, many deep-sea organisms either reduce the density of their skeletal systems or abandon them altogether, relying instead on softer, more flexible tissues that can withstand pressure without breaking. This leads to forms that appear fragile, almost insubstantial, when brought to the surface, but are perfectly suited to their native environment. The absence of rigid support is not a weakness. It is a solution to a problem that cannot be addressed through strength alone. Movement is also affected. Muscles must function under conditions where resistance is higher and energy is limited. Rapid contractions are less sustainable, reinforcing the shift towards slower, more deliberate motion that has already begun to emerge in previous layers. Every action must be efficient, every movement justified by a clear benefit. There is no margin for excess. Even the composition of cell membranes changes, becoming more fluid to maintain functionality under pressure. These adjustments ensure that cells can continue to exchange materials, communicate and maintain internal balance despite the external force acting upon them. What becomes clear is that survival at these depths is not determined by a single adaptation, but by a coordinated set of changes that operate across multiple levels of organization. From molecular stability to overall body structure, every aspect of the organism must align with the conditions imposed by pressure. This creates a form of life that is highly specialized, not in the sense of being complex or elaborate, but in being precisely tuned to a narrow range of environmental parameters. These organisms are not built to function anywhere else, if brought to the surface. Where pressure is significantly lower, their adaptations can become liabilities. Gases expand, structures lose support, and the chemical balance that sustains them is disrupted. What is stable in one environment becomes unstable in another. This reversibility highlights how deeply integrated these adaptations are, how completely life in the deep ocean is shaped by the conditions in which it exists. Pressure does not simply influence life here, it defines it. As depth continues to increase, the constraints become even more severe, pushing organisms to the limits of what is chemically and structurally possible. The range of viable forms narrows further, and the solutions that emerge become more refined, more specific, and often more difficult to interpret from a surface perspective. Survival is no longer about competing within a broad environment, but about maintaining equilibrium within a set of conditions that leave little room for variation. The deeper you go, the more life becomes a matter of balance at the smallest scales, where the ability to function depends not on visible traits, but on the stability of interactions that cannot be seen directly. And as these pressures continue to intensify, they will shape the next stage of this descent, influencing not just how organisms survive, but what forms they are able to take at all. As pressure continues to define what is possible at every level, shaping molecules and limiting the stability of rigid forms, the consequences begin to appear more clearly in the overall design of living organisms. The structures that dominate life near the surface, dense bones, firm muscles, clearly defined shapes built for strength and speed, become less practical the deeper the environment presses against them. What once provided support and protection begins to introduce risk, creating points of resistance in a world where resistance itself is a liability. In response, many organisms abandon the idea of structure as it is commonly understood. Instead of reinforcing their bodies to withstand external force, they yield to it, adopting forms that allow pressure to pass through rather than act against them. This shift is not immediately intuitive. From a surface perspective, strength is associated with durability, with the ability to resist force and maintain shape under stress. But in the deep ocean, resisting pressure is not a viable strategy. The force is too great, too constant, too evenly distributed to be countered through rigidity alone. Any structure that attempts to hold its shape against that force risks failure at its weakest point. Softness, by contrast, offers a different solution. By reducing internal differences in density, by eliminating rigid boundaries that can be compressed unevenly, these organisms effectively remove the conditions under which damage would occur. Their bodies become continuous with the surrounding environment, shaped not in opposition to pressure, but in alignment with it. Jellyfish-like organisms provide some of the clearest examples of this approach. Composed largely of water with minimal structural components, they exist in a state that is closer to fluid than solid. Their tissues are flexible, capable of deforming without breaking, and their movements are slow, relying on gentle contractions rather than forceful propulsion. In the deep ocean, this form becomes even more pronounced. Gelatinous creatures drift through the water with almost no resistance, their bodies barely distinguishable from the medium that surrounds them. They do not need to support themselves against gravity in the same way as surface animals, as buoyancy reduces the need for internal reinforcement. Instead, they maintain their position through subtle adjustments, allowing currents to carry them while retaining just enough control to respond when necessary. This approach extends beyond simple drifting organisms. Even fish, which are often associated with more defined structures, begin to adopt softer forms as depth increases. Gelatinous fish, sometimes referred to as blob-like species when observed at the surface, are in fact highly adapted to their native environment. Their tissues are less dense, their muscles reduced, their skeletons lighter and more flexible. This reduces the energy required to maintain buoyancy and allows them to exist without the constant need for active swimming. In a world where energy is scarce, this efficiency becomes essential. What appears fragile when removed from its environment is in fact a stable and effective design within it. Deep-sea squid offer another variation on this theme, combining soft body structures with more active movement when required. Their bodies lack the heavy support systems found in surface species, allowing them to compress and expand without damage under pressure. Their movements are controlled, deliberate, often relying on short bursts of propulsion rather than sustained activity. Even their internal systems reflect this balance, with adaptations that maintain functionality under conditions that would disrupt more rigid forms. Across these examples, a consistent pattern emerges. The deeper the environment, the less emphasis is placed on maintaining a fixed shape. Instead, flexibility, compressibility, and fluidity become the defining characteristics of successful organisms. This does not mean that all structure disappears, but that it is redefined. Support is no longer about resisting external force, but about maintaining internal coherence while allowing the body to adapt to constant pressure. The boundaries between organism and environment become less distinct, with bodies that interact with their surroundings in a more continuous, less confrontational way. This has implications not only for survival, but for how these organisms are perceived. When brought to the surface, many of these creatures appear distorted, collapsed, or damaged. Their bodies, adapted to high pressure, expand or lose shape when that pressure is removed. What seems like fragility is often a result of being taken out of the conditions for which they are designed. In their native environment, they are stable, functional, and precisely adapted to the constraints they face. The idea that strength equates to rigidity does not apply here. Strength in this context is the ability to exist without resisting the forces that surround you, to maintain function without imposing unnecessary structure. It is a form of resilience that operates through adaptation rather than opposition. As the descent continues, this principle will extend further, influencing not just individual organisms, but the overall composition of life in these depths. The prevalence of soft-bodied forms increases, and the characteristics that define them become more pronounced. What remains constant is the underlying logic that in a world defined by pressure and scarcity, the most effective solutions are often those that reduce complexity, that align with the environment rather than challenge it, and that allow life to persist in conditions where traditional forms would fail. As bodies become softer and more fluid, as structure is reduced to accommodate pressure and conserve energy, it might seem logical that life would continue in this direction, becoming smaller, simpler, and more minimal over time. In a world where food is scarce and movement is costly, reducing size would appear to be an advantage. Smaller organisms require less energy, can survive on fewer resources, and place fewer demands on an environment that offers very little in return. And yet, as the descent continues, this expectation begins to break in a way that feels almost contradictory. Among the drifting gelatinous forms and slow-moving creatures adapted to scarcity, there are organisms that grow far larger than their relatives near the surface, expanding in size despite the very conditions that should limit them. This phenomenon, 3, known as deep-sea gigantism, introduces a contrast that is difficult to reconcile at first. In an environment defined by limitation, some species do not shrink, they expand. Giant isopods are among the most striking examples of this pattern. Related to the small terrestrial woodlice that can be found under stones and leaves, these deep-sea crustaceans can reach sizes that feel disproportionate to their lineage. Their segmented bodies, armoured plates, and multiple legs give them a familiar structure, but their scale transforms that familiarity into something unfamiliar, almost unsettling. They move slowly across the seafloor, not as active hunters, but as opportunistic scavengers, feeding on whatever organic material they encounter. Their size is not a result of excess food or rapid growth. It is the outcome of a different set of advantages that operate under deep-sea conditions. Amphipods, another group of crustaceans, display similar tendencies. While many species remain small, others grow to significant sizes, occupying niches that require both resilience and the ability to store energy over long periods. These organisms are not constantly feeding. They cannot rely on regular access to food. Instead, they must be prepared for long intervals of scarcity, periods where no significant resources are available. In this context, size becomes a form of storage, a way to accumulate and retain energy that can be used gradually over time. The explanation for this pattern is not based on a single factor, but on a combination of environmental conditions that interact in specific ways. Temperature plays a central role. In the deep ocean, temperatures remain consistently low, often just above freezing. These cold conditions slow down metabolic processes, reducing the rate at which organisms consume energy. Growth becomes slower, but so does decay. Larger bodies can be maintained without the same level of continuous input required in warmer environments. This creates a situation where increasing size does not carry the same cost as it would near the surface. At the same time, pressure and oxygen availability influence how energy is used and stored. In deeper waters, oxygen levels can vary, but many organisms are adapted to function efficiently with limited supply. Combined with slow metabolism, this allows for extended periods without feeding. A larger body can store more reserves, providing a buffer against the unpredictability of food availability. When a significant food source does appear, such as a carcass sinking from above, these organisms can consume large quantities at once, storing energy that will sustain them long after the immediate opportunity has passed. This strategy aligns with a broader pattern of efficiency that defines life at these depths. Instead of constant activity, there are moments of intense consumption, followed by extended periods of inactivity. Size, in this context, supports that cycle, allowing organisms to take full advantage of rare events without requiring continuous access to resources. It also provides a degree of resilience, making them less vulnerable to short-term fluctuations in food supply. There are additional advantages as well. Larger size can reduce the number of potential predators, yet as fewer species are capable of consuming larger organisms. It can also improve the ability to move across the seafloor or through the water column in a controlled, energy-efficient manner. In some cases, it may enhance sensory capabilities, allowing for better detection of food sources or environmental changes. What makes this phenomenon particularly interesting is how it contrasts with the general trend toward reduction and efficiency. While many organisms become smaller, softer, and less structured, others expand, increasing their physical presence in a way that seems at odds with the surrounding environment. This is not a contradiction, but a reflection of the diversity of strategies that can emerge under the same set of constraints. The deep ocean does not favour a single solution. It allows for multiple approaches, and each optimise for different aspects of survival. Some organisms minimise their energy use by reducing size and complexity. Others maximise their ability to endure scarcity by increasing their capacity to store and retain resources. Both strategies are valid, both are effective, and both are shaped by the same underlying conditions. The presence of these larger forms also changes the dynamics of the ecosystem. They interact with their environment in ways that smaller organisms cannot, influencing how resources are distributed and how energy flows through the system. Their movements, though slow, can cover larger areas, and their feeding habits can impact the availability of material for other species. They become part of the structure of the deep-sea environment, not just as individuals, but as contributors to the overall balance of life at these depths. As the descent continues, this balance becomes even more complex, with different strategies intersecting and overlapping in ways that reflect the ongoing negotiation between limitation and adaptation. The presence of giants in such a restrictive environment serves as a reminder that evolution does not follow a single path, but explores multiple possibilities, each shaped by the conditions in which it unfolds. As size expands in some directions and structure dissolves in others, the overall pace of life continues to slow, not as a temporary condition, but as a defining characteristic of the environment itself. Movement becomes less frequent, interactions more spaced out, and the sense of urgency that defines surface ecosystems begins to disappear almost entirely. There is no constant motion here, no continuous flow of activity that signals abundance or competition. Instead, the deep ocean settles into a rhythm that is difficult to perceive at first, one that unfolds over extended periods, where events that would seem brief elsewhere stretch into long intervals of stillness. The idea of time, as it is experienced near the surface, begins to lose its relevance. Processes that happen quickly in warmer and more energy-rich environments take far longer here. Growth slows, reproduction becomes less frequent, and even basic biological functions operate at a reduced pace. Temperature plays a significant role in this shift. The deep ocean remains consistently cold, often hovering just above freezing, and this has a direct effect on metabolic rates. Chemical reactions proceed more slowly at lower temperatures, reducing the speed at which energy is used and replenished. For organisms living in these conditions, this is not a limitation to overcome, but a parameter to work within. Their entire biology is calibrated to function at this reduced rate, ensuring that energy consumption remains aligned with the limited resources available. This slow pace extends to nearly every aspect of life. Some deep-sea fish are known to live for decades, growing at rates that would be considered negligible in other environments. Reproductive cycles can span years, with long intervals between breeding events. In certain species, the development of offspring is prolonged, with extended gestation periods that reflect the overall reduction in biological activity. These are not signs of inefficiency, but of adaptation, strategies that prioritize long-term survival over rapid expansion. Movement, when it occurs, is deliberate and measured. Creatures drift rather than swim, glide rather than chase, conserving energy by minimizing unnecessary activity. Even predators, as previously observed, rely on stillness and timing rather than continuous pursuit. The water itself appears calm, not because there is no life, but because that life is not expressed through constant motion. It exists in a state of readiness, where action is reserved for specific moments rather than maintained as a continuous condition. This creates an environment where encounters between organisms are less frequent, but often more significant. When two creatures meet, the interaction carries more weight, as it may represent a rare opportunity for feeding, reproduction, or competition. There is no redundancy in these events. Each one has the potential to influence survival in a way that is disproportionate to its duration. The ecosystem, as a result, is not driven by constant interaction, but by a series of isolated events connected by long periods of inactivity. Energy flows through this system in a similar manner. Instead of being continuously generated and consumed, it arrives in pulses, often originating from the layers above. Organic material drifts downward, sometimes in small, steady amounts, sometimes in larger, less predictable accumulations. When these resources become available, they're utilized efficiently, often by multiple organisms over extended periods. A single event, such as the arrival of a larger food source, can sustain an entire community for weeks, months, or even years, depending on its size and the number of organisms involved. This pattern reinforces the need for patience. There is no advantage in expending energy in anticipation of food that may not appear. Instead, organisms must be prepared to endure, to maintain their internal balance until the next opportunity arises. This requires not only physical adaptations, but behavioral ones as well. Activity is minimized, responses are measured, and the threshold for action is higher than in more dynamic environments. The result is a system that appears almost static when viewed from the outside, but is in fact highly responsive within its own framework. Small changes, subtle signals, and infrequent events carry significant meaning, shaping the behavior of organisms that are tuned to detect and respond to them with precision. This sensitivity replaces the need for constant movement, allowing life to function effectively without the continuous expenditure of energy. Even communication reflects this slower pace. Signals are not repeated rapidly or broadcast continuously. They are used sparingly, often in specific contexts where the benefit justifies the cost. Bioluminescent displays, chemical cues, and physical interactions are all employed with a level of restraint that mirrors the overall economy of the environment. Nothing is wasted, and nothing occurs without purpose. This does not mean that the deep ocean is devoid of complexity. On the contrary, the interactions that do occur are often intricate, shaped by long periods of adaptation and refinement. But that complexity is expressed differently, not through constant activity, but through efficiency, precision, and the ability to function over extended timescales. The deeper you go, the more this pattern becomes evident. Life is not driven by urgency, but by endurance. It is not defined by how quickly organisms can act, but by how long they can sustain themselves between actions. In this sense, the deep ocean operates on a different understanding of time, one where survival is measured not in moments, but in the ability to persist through long intervals of stillness, waiting for the next opportunity to emerge. In a world where movement is rare and energy arrives in small, uncertain amounts, there are moments when the balance shifts completely, when the slow, patient rhythm of the deep ocean is interrupted by an event so significant that it reshapes everything around it. These moments do not begin with life, but with its end. Far above, near the surface where energy is abundant and ecosystems are active, a large animal dies. It may be a whale, one of the largest living creatures on Earth, whose body has spent decades moving through the upper layers of the ocean, feeding, migrating, existing within a system defined by sunlight and constant motion. When it dies, its body begins to sink. There is no resistance strong enough to stop it, no current that carries it away indefinitely. It descends slowly, steadily, and passing through the layers it once inhabited, moving into regions where it has never lived. As it falls, smaller organisms begin to gather, feeding on the soft tissues, removing parts of the body before it reaches the seafloor. But much of it remains intact, continuing downward until it finally comes to rest on the ocean floor, a sudden and massive arrival of organic material in a place where such abundance is almost unheard of. For the surrounding environment, this is not just an isolated event. It is the beginning of an entirely new ecosystem. The first to respond are the scavengers, organisms adapted to detect and exploit rare sources of food. They arrive quickly, drawn by chemical signals released as the body begins to break down. Giant isopods, amphipods, and various species of fish converge on the carcass. Their movements more rapid than usual, their behaviour shifting in response to the sudden availability of resources. What follows is a period of intense activity, a temporary acceleration of the otherwise slow pace of the deep ocean. Flesh is consumed in large quantities, often over the course of days or weeks, as these scavengers take advantage of a food source that may not appear again for years. The scale of this consumption is significant, but it is only the first stage in a process that extends far beyond the initial feeding frenzy. As the soft tissues are removed, what remains is the skeleton, a structure that contains not only bone but also lipids, complex organic compounds that can sustain life over much longer periods. This is where the ecosystem begins to transform. Bacteria capable of breaking down these compounds colonize the bones, initiating a series of chemical reactions that release energy in forms that other organisms can use. The environment around the carcass changes, becoming enriched with substances that are otherwise scarce in the surrounding water. This creates conditions that support a different set of organisms, ones that are not dependent on drifting food or opportunistic scavenging, but on the chemical processes taking place within the remains of the whale. Among the most distinctive of these organisms are the so-called zombie worms, known scientifically as ozodax. They have no mouth, no digestive system in the conventional sense. Instead, they extend root-like structures into the bones, where they host symbiotic bacteria that break down the lipids and release nutrients that the worms can absorb. Their bodies are adapted entirely to this purpose, lacking features that would be unnecessary in an environment where their food source is fixed and abundant for extended periods. They do not move across the seafloor in search of food. They grow directly into it, becoming part of the structure they consume. This stage can last for years, sometimes decades, depending on the size of the carcass and the conditions of the surrounding environment. During this time, the whalefowl supports a diverse community of organisms, each adapted to a specific role within the system. Some feed directly on the remaining material, others on the bacteria, and still others on the organisms that gather there. The initial event, the death of a single animal, expands into a complex network of interactions that persists long after the original form has been reduced to its basic components. Even after the bones are fully degraded, the impact of the whalefowl does not end immediately. The surrounding sediment may remain enriched, supporting organisms that benefit from the residual nutrients. The event leaves a lasting imprint on the environment, altering the distribution of life in a way that extends beyond the immediate area of the carcass. What makes this process particularly significant is how it contrasts with the general conditions of the deep ocean. In a system defined by scarcity, where energy arrives slowly and unpredictably, a whalefowl represents a concentrated influx of resources that can sustain an entire community over extended periods. It is not just a source of food, but a foundation for life, a temporary centre of activity in an otherwise sparse landscape. It also highlights the interconnected nature of the ocean's layers. The energy that supports this deep-sea ecosystem originates from the surface, from an organism that lived in a completely different environment. Its descent carries that energy downward, redistributing it in a way that connects distant parts of the ocean through a single event. The boundaries between layers, while distinct in many ways, are not absolute. They are linked through processes that transfer material and energy across depths, creating relationships that are not immediately visible, but are essential to the functioning of the system as a whole. In this way, death becomes not an end, but a transformation. A transition from one form of life to another, mediated by the conditions of the deep ocean. It is a reminder that even in a place defined by limitation and stillness, there are moments of change that reshape the environment, creating opportunities for life to emerge in forms that are as complex and interconnected as those found near the surface. What the whalefall reveals, in a concentrated and almost dramatic way, is that life in the deep ocean does not always follow the same rules as life above. It shows that energy can arrive from unexpected sources, that entire ecosystems can form around events that begin far from where they end. But even this process still depends in some indirect way on the surface. The whale itself lived in sunlight, fed on organisms that relied on photosynthesis, and carried that energy downward when it died. It is still part of the same system, just redistributed. What comes next breaks that connection entirely. There are places in the deep ocean where life does not depend on sunlight at all, not even indirectly, where the energy that sustains entire ecosystems originates from the Earth itself rather than from the Sun. These environments are found along the boundaries of tectonic plates, where the seafloor spreads apart and allows water to penetrate deep into the Earth's crust. As this water moves downward, it is heated by underlying magma, becoming superheated and enriched with dissolved minerals before being forced back up through openings in the seafloor. When it emerges, it does so as a hydrothermal vent, releasing plumes of hot, chemically rich fluid into the surrounding cold water. At first, these vents appear hostile, even destructive. Temperatures can exceed 300 degrees Celsius, and the water they emit is laden with substances that would be toxic to most forms of life. The contrast between the hot vent fluid and the near-freezing ocean water creates turbulent flows, sharp gradients, and an environment that seems incompatible with the stability required for biological systems. And yet around these vents, life not only exists, it thrives. The foundation of this ecosystem is not photosynthesis, but chemosynthesis, a process in which certain microorganisms convert chemical energy into organic material. Instead of using sunlight to drive this conversion, they rely on the chemical compounds present in the vent fluid, such as hydrogen sulfide. These bacteria oxidize these compounds, releasing energy that they use to produce the molecules necessary for life. In doing so, they create a new base for the food chain, one that operates entirely independently of the sun. This shift is profound. It demonstrates that life does not require light as a primary energy source, that it can emerge and sustain itself in conditions where sunlight has never reached. Around these bacteria, entire communities develop, structured in ways that mirror surface ecosystems but are driven by completely different inputs. Among the most distinctive inhabitants of these environments are tube worms, organisms that can grow to lengths of over 2 meters, anchored to the seafloor near active vents. They lack a mouth, a digestive tract, or any of the conventional structures associated with feeding. Instead, they rely entirely on a symbiotic relationship with the bacteria that live within their bodies. These bacteria process the chemical compounds from the vent fluid, producing nutrients that the worm absorbs directly. The worm in turn provides the bacteria with access to the necessary chemicals and oxygen, creating a closed system in which both organisms depend entirely on each other. The tube worm's structure reflects this relationship. Its bright red plume, extending into the water above, is not for feeding in the traditional sense, but for absorbing oxygen and transporting it, along with hydrogen sulfide, to the bacteria housed within its tissues. Its body is essentially a support system for this internal ecosystem, maintaining the conditions required for the bacteria to function. It is not an independent organism in the way surface animals are. It is a partnership, a combination of biological processes that together form a single, integrated unit. Surrounding these tube worms are other organisms that have adapted to the unique conditions of the vent environment. Crabs, shrimp, and various species of fish occupy different niches within this system, feeding on the bacteria, on each other, or on the organic material produced by the primary chemosynthetic processes. Some species have developed specialized adaptations, such as heat-resistant proteins or modified sensory systems that allow them to navigate the complex chemical landscape around the vents. The ecosystem is dynamic, shaped by the activity of the vents themselves. When a vent becomes inactive, the flow of chemical energy stops, and the community that depended on it must either disperse or decline. New vents form elsewhere, creating new centers of activity that attract organisms from surrounding areas. This results in a patchwork of ecosystems, each with its own life cycle, emerging and fading as geological processes reshape the seafloor. What makes these environments particularly significant is not just their existence, but what they imply about the nature of life itself. If life can arise and sustain itself in complete darkness, using chemical energy from the Earth rather than light from the Sun, then the range of possible environments that can support life is far broader than previously assumed. The deep ocean, in this sense, becomes more than just an extreme environment. It becomes a model for understanding how life might exist in other places under conditions that are very different from those on the surface of our own planet. Within the context of this descent, it represents a further step away from the familiar, a point at which even the indirect influence of sunlight is no longer necessary. The organisms here are not connected to the surface through falling debris or migrating species. They are sustained by processes that originate deep within the Earth, independent of the cycles that govern the upper ocean. This marks a shift not just in adaptation, but in the fundamental source of energy that drives life, reinforcing the idea that as depth increases, the assumptions that define our understanding of biology continue to lose their hold. Beyond the hydrothermal vents, where chemical energy replaces sunlight and entire ecosystems form around the Earth's internal processes, the descent continues into regions that push even those adaptations toward their limits. The seafloor is not uniform. It fractures and folds, forming deep trenches that extend far below the surrounding ocean floor, narrow depressions that descend into what is known as the Hadal zone. These trenches, some reaching depths of over 10,000 meters, represent the most extreme environments on the planet's surface, places where pressure reaches levels that challenge even the most specialized forms of life. At these depths, the weight of the water above becomes almost unimaginable, exerting forces that would collapse most structures, disrupt most biological processes, and render conventional adaptations ineffective. The conditions here are not just an extension of the deep ocean, but an amplification of its most restrictive features, where every limitation is intensified and every viable form of life must operate at the edge of what is chemically and physically possible. It is within this environment that one of the most remarkable examples of adaptation can be found: a small, unassuming fish that exists at depths where few other vertebrates can survive. The snailfish, particularly species belonging to the genus Pseudoliparis, has been observed at depths exceeding 8,000 meters, making it the deepest living vertebrate known. Its appearance does not immediately suggest resilience. Its body is soft, almost translucent, yet lacking the rigid structures and defined musculature associated with fish in shallower waters. It appears delicate, even fragile when brought into view, but this form is precisely what allows it to exist where others cannot. The snailfish does not resist the pressure of its environment. It accommodates it. Its tissues are gelatinous, reducing the difference in density between its body and the surrounding water, minimizing the effects of compression. Its skeleton is lightly developed, providing just enough structure to maintain form without introducing points of weakness. But the most significant adaptations occur at a level that cannot be seen directly. At these depths, pressure does not simply act on the exterior of the organism, it penetrates, influencing the behavior of molecules, altering the interactions that sustain life at the cellular level. Proteins, as previously noted, are particularly sensitive to these conditions. Their function depends on their shape, and that shape can be disrupted by the forces present in the Hadal zone. For most vertebrates, this disruption would be fatal, preventing enzymes from catalyzing reactions, halting metabolic processes, and leading to the breakdown of essential systems. The snailfish, however, has developed a way to stabilize these molecular structures under extreme pressure. It accumulates high concentrations of compounds known as osmolytes, specifically trimethylamine N oxide, or TMAO, within its cells. This molecule counteracts the destabilizing effects of pressure on proteins, allowing them to maintain their functional shape even under immense compression. The concentration of TMAO increases with depth, reflecting the need for greater stabilization as pressure intensifies. This creates a direct relationship between the environment and the internal chemistry of the organism, where survival depends on maintaining a precise balance of molecular components that support life under these conditions. This adaptation, while effective, also imposes limits. There is a point at which the concentration of TMAO required to stabilize proteins would become too high, interfering with other aspects of cellular function. This sets a boundary for how deep vertebrates can exist, a limit defined not by external structure, but by internal chemistry. The snailfish exists near this boundary, occupying a range where its adaptations remain effective, but beyond which the balance can no longer be maintained. Its presence at these depths represents not just an example of extreme adaptation, but an indication of the limits of what is possible for complex life in the ocean. The environment of the Hadal zone is not only defined by pressure, but by isolation. These trenches are often separated from each other by vast distances, creating pockets of habitat that are relatively disconnected. This can lead to unique evolutionary paths, where species adapt to specific conditions within a single trench, developing characteristics that may not be found elsewhere. The snailfish, in its various forms, reflects this pattern, with different species adapted to different trenches, each responding to the specific conditions of its environment. Despite the isolation, life persists, supported by the same slow processes that define the rest of the deep ocean. Organic material continues to drift downward, though in even smaller quantities. Occasional larger inputs, such as carcasses, may reach these depths, providing temporary increases in available energy. But for the most part, life here operates under the same constraints of scarcity, patience, and efficiency, amplified by the extreme conditions of the environment. The snailfish, moving slowly along the seafloor or hovering just above it, feeds on small invertebrates, organisms that have themselves adapted to these depths. Its movements are controlled, its behavior consistent with the overall pattern of reduced activity. It does not need to move quickly or frequently. It needs to function reliably within a narrow set of conditions that allow it to persist where others cannot. What makes this adaptation particularly significant is not just the ability to survive at such depths, but the way in which that survival is achieved. It is not through resistance, not through building stronger structures or more powerful systems, but through alignment with the environment at the most fundamental level. The snailfish does not overcome the conditions of the Hadal zone. It exists within them, its biology tuned to the precise requirements of a world defined by pressure, darkness, and limited energy. In this sense, it represents a culmination of the patterns observed throughout the descent, where each layer introduces new constraints and each adaptation responds by refining the relationship between organism and environment. As the descent approaches its deepest points, the presence of such life forms underscores the extent to which life can adapt, while also revealing the boundaries beyond which even the most specialized systems may not be able to function. As pressure defines the limits of what can exist and chemistry determines how life sustains itself at the deepest boundaries, Another form of adaptation continues to evolve in parallel, one that is less about enduring the environment and more about avoiding detection within it. In a space where encounters are rare but consequential, where movement is limited and opportunities are unpredictable, being seen can carry immediate consequences. The strategies that emerge are not focused on escape through speed or confrontation through strength, but on preventing the interaction from occurring at all. Visibility itself becomes the problem to solve, and the solutions that arise are among the most refined in the entire ocean. Transparency is one of the most effective of these solutions, not as a simple reduction of colour, but as complete restructuring of how an organism interacts with light. In environments where even minimal illumination can reveal form, removing visible structure becomes a way of eliminating contrast. Some organisms achieve this to an extent that challenges perception, their bodies composed in such a way that light passes through them with minimal scattering, leaving only faint outlines or isolated internal components as evidence of their presence. The glass squid is one of the clearest examples of this approach, its body nearly invisible in the surrounding water, with only its eyes and digestive system remaining visible as small, suspended features within an otherwise transparent form. It moves slowly, not because it lacks the ability to move quickly, but because its strategy does not depend on speed. It depends on not being detected in the first place. This form of invisibility is not absolute. Complete transparency is difficult to achieve, particularly in larger organisms where internal structures are necessary for function. But even partial transparency can significantly reduce visibility, especially in low-light conditions where contrast is already limited. By minimizing the difference between their bodies and the surrounding water, these organisms reduce the likelihood that predators or prey will detect them, effectively removing themselves from the visual field. This strategy is particularly effective in the upper regions of the deep ocean, where faint light from above still exists, creating silhouettes that can reveal the presence of organisms below. Transparency disrupts that silhouette, though making it difficult to distinguish form from background. In deeper regions where external light is absent and bioluminescence becomes the primary source of illumination, a different strategy emerges, one that involves actively controlling the light emitted by the organism itself. Counter-illumination is a technique in which organisms produce light along their undersides that matches the faint residual glow from above, effectively erasing their silhouette when viewed from below. This is not a passive adaptation. It requires precise control over the intensity and distribution of light, ensuring that it aligns with the ambient conditions at a given depth. The organism must adjust its output continuously, responding to changes in light intensity as it moves through the water column. This creates a form of dynamic camouflage, where the organism does not simply blend into a static background, but actively replicates it in real time. Some species of squid and fish are capable of this, using specialized light-producing organs called photophores to generate controlled emissions that match the surrounding light. These photophores can be adjusted in brightness, allowing the organism to fine-tune its appearance and remain effectively invisible from certain angles. The precision of this system reflects the importance of avoiding detection in an environment where encounters are limited but often decisive. In addition to transparency and counter-illumination, other adaptations contribute to this overall strategy of disappearance. Some organisms develop reflective surfaces that scatter incoming light in multiple directions, reducing the formation of distinct outlines. Others adopt body shapes that minimize shadow or disruption in the water, further reducing the likelihood of detection. Even behavior plays a role, with many species limiting movement to avoid creating disturbances that could be sensed by others. These strategies are not isolated. They often combine within a single organism, creating multiple layers of concealment that operate under different conditions. A creature may be partially transparent, capable of counter-illumination and equipped with sensory systems that detect even the smallest changes in its surroundings, allowing it to respond before it is detected. This integration of adaptations reflects the complexity of the environment, where no single solution is sufficient on its own. The deeper you go, the more these strategies become refined, shaped by the specific conditions of each layer. In regions where light is completely absent, visibility may seem irrelevant, but bioluminescence reintroduces it in a controlled form. Organisms must then adapt not only to avoid natural light, but to manage the artificial light produced by themselves and others. This creates a system where visibility is constantly shifting, where being seen depends not just on external conditions, but on the interactions between organisms that generate and respond to light. The result is an environment where presence and absence are not fixed states, but variables that can be adjusted through biological processes. An organism may be visible in one context and effectively invisible in another, depending on how it manages its interaction with light. This fluidity adds another layer of complexity to the deep ocean, where the boundaries between detection and concealment are not clearly defined, but are instead part of an ongoing balance between opposing forces. What emerges from this is not just a set of adaptations, but a broader principle that extends throughout the deep ocean. Survival is not always about overcoming challenges directly. In many cases, it is about avoiding them entirely, about reducing interaction to the point where conflict becomes unnecessary. The art of disappearing in this sense is not a passive state but an active process, one that requires constant adjustment and precise control over the factors that determine visibility. As the descent continues, this principle will intersect with others, shaping how life persists in environments that continue to push the limits of what can be seen, what can be sensed, and what can be understood. As strategies for avoiding detection become more refined, and the ability to exist within extreme conditions reaches its most advanced forms, the descent approaches a point where adaptation no longer continues indefinitely. Up to this stage, every challenge introduced by depth, darkness, pressure, scarcity, has been met with some form of adjustment, a modification of structure or behaviour that allows life to persist. But there is a boundary that does not yield in the same way, a limit that is not easily negotiated through incremental change. It is not defined by a single factor, but by the convergence of several, each reinforcing the others until the conditions required for complex life can no longer be maintained. In the Hadal depths, where trenches reach their greatest extremes, the environment begins to impose constraints that operate at the most fundamental level of biology. Pressure, already a dominant force, continues to increase, but it is not pressure alone that defines this boundary. It is the cumulative effect of pressure on the chemistry of life, on the stability of molecules, on the ability of cells to function in a coordinated way. For vertebrates, this becomes particularly significant. Their biology depends on a set of interactions that must remain within a narrow range of conditions. Enzymes must retain their shape, membranes must maintain their integrity, and the processes that generate and use energy must remain balanced. As depth increases, the mechanisms that support these functions become more difficult to sustain. The accumulation of stabilizing compounds such as TMAO can offset the effects of pressure to a certain extent, but this solution has limits. Beyond a certain concentration, these compounds begin to interfere with other aspects of cellular function, creating a trade-off that cannot be resolved indefinitely. This establishes a threshold, a depth beyond which vertebrate life, as it is currently structured, cannot exist. Observations of snailfish at extreme depths approach this boundary, but do not extend beyond it. There are no known vertebrates living deeper than this range, not because the environment lacks space or resources entirely, but because the conditions exceed what their biology can accommodate. This absence is not immediately visible. The seafloor continues, the trenches extend further, and life does not disappear completely. But the forms that persist beyond this point are different. They are simpler, less dependent on complex internal systems, and more adaptable to the chemical constraints imposed by extreme pressure. Invertebrates, microorganisms, and other forms of life continue to exist, their structures and processes less restricted by the limitations that affect vertebrates. This creates a transition that is not marked by a sudden absence of life, but by a shift in its composition. The deeper regions are not empty, but they are different, populated by organisms that operate under a different set of constraints, with different solutions to the challenges of their environment. The concept of a biological limit is not unique to the deep ocean, but here it is expressed in a particularly clear way. It is not a boundary that can be crossed through gradual adaptation, but one that emerges from the interaction of multiple factors that together define what is possible. Temperature remains low, pressure remains high, and energy remains scarce, but it is the combination of these conditions that creates the threshold. Remove any one of them, and the limit might shift. But in the deep ocean, they are all present simultaneously, reinforcing each other and narrowing the range of viable forms. This has implications for how we understand life in extreme environments more broadly. It suggests that while life can adapt to a wide range of conditions, there are points at which those adaptations reach their limits, where the solutions that have worked up to a certain depth or temperature or pressure can no longer be extended. And these limits are not fixed in a universal sense. They depend on the specific biology of the organisms in question, on the structures and processes that define them, but they are real, and they shape the distribution of life in ways that are not immediately apparent from the surface. In the context of this descent, the recognition of such a boundary introduces a different kind of perspective. Up to this point, each layer has revealed new forms, new strategies, new ways in which life adapts to increasingly restrictive conditions. The expectation, perhaps, is that this pattern will continue indefinitely, that life will find a way to persist no matter how extreme the environment becomes. But the presence of a limit challenges that assumption. It suggests that adaptation is not an open-ended process, but one that operates within constraints that cannot always be overcome. At the same time, the continuation of a life beyond this boundary, in forms that are not bound by the same limitations, highlights the diversity of solutions that evolution can produce. The absence of vertebrates does not mean the absence of life. It marks a transition to a different set of possibilities, where simpler systems can function, where more complex ones cannot. This shift does not diminish the significance of life in these depths. If anything, it emphasizes the range of conditions under which life can exist, while also clarifying the boundaries that define its different forms. As the descent reaches these deepest regions, the environment becomes less about variation and more about extremes, where the conditions approach the limits of what biology can sustain. The patterns observed throughout the ocean, adaptation, efficiency, specialization, remain present, but they are constrained by factors that cannot be adjusted indefinitely. What remains is a system that operates at the edge of possibility, where life persists not through expansion, but through precise alignment with the conditions that allow it to exist at all. Even at the point where vertebrate life reaches its limits, where the conditions of pressure and chemistry define a boundary that cannot be crossed by more complex organisms, the descent does not end in absence. The seafloor continues, the trenches deepen, and beneath them lies something that is not immediately visible, something that exists outside the framework of ecosystems as they have been described so far. It is easy to think of life in terms of communities, of interactions between species, of food chains and energy flows that connect organisms to one another and to their environment. But beneath the ocean floor, within the sediments and the rock itself, life exists in a form that does not rely on these structures, operating at a scale and pace that challenges the way we define what it means to be alive. The surface of the seafloor, that even in its deepest regions is still part of the ocean, still influenced by the slow rain of organic material from above and the occasional arrival of larger inputs such as carcasses. But just below that surface, within layers of sediment that have accumulated over millions of years, conditions change again. Oxygen becomes scarce or disappears entirely. Movement is limited not just by the environment, but by the physical structure of the material itself. There is no open space for organisms to travel, no currents to carry nutrients, no light, no clear boundaries between one organism and another. And yet, within this compact, seemingly inert environment, life persists. Microorganisms inhabit these sediments and the rock beneath them, existing in spaces that are measured not in meters, but in microscopic gaps between particles. These organisms do not form visible communities. They do not interact in ways that can be easily observed. Their presence is often inferred through chemical measurements, through the detection of metabolic activity that indicates that something is occurring, even if it cannot be seen directly. What distinguishes this form of life from that found above is not just its scale, but its pace. The processes that sustain these organisms operate at rates that are orders of magnitude slower than those observed in more familiar environments. Metabolic activity is minimal, energy consumption reduced to the lowest possible level that still allows for the maintenance of cellular function. In some cases, the rate of division is so slow that a single cell may take years, decades, or even longer to reproduce. This is not a temporary state of dormancy, but a continuous mode of existence, one in which life is sustained at the edge of what is chemically possible. The energy sources available in this environment are limited and often indirect. Instead of relying on organic material produced elsewhere, these microorganisms may utilize chemical gradients within the rock, deriving energy from reactions that occur between minerals and the surrounding water. These reactions are slow, often producing only small amounts of usable energy, but they are consistent, providing a steady, if minimal, supply that can support life over extended periods. In some cases, the energy required to sustain these organisms is so low that it approaches the theoretical minimum for life, blurring the distinction between active metabolism and a state that is closer to persistence than to activity. This challenges conventional definitions of ecosystems, which are typically based on interactions between organisms and the flow of energy through a system. In the sediments beneath the ocean floor, these interactions are minimal or absent. Organisms may exist in isolation, separated by physical barriers that prevent direct contact. The flow of energy is not dynamic, not characterized by cycles of growth and consumption, but by a slow, continuous process that operates over geological timescales. Life here is not part of a network in the same way as it is above. It is distributed, sparse, and largely independent, sustained by conditions that are stable but extremely limited. The implications of this are significant. It suggests that life does not require the complexity of an ecosystem to exist, that it can persist in environments where interaction is minimal and energy is scarce. It also expands the range of conditions under which life can be found, indicating that the boundaries of the biosphere extend beyond what is visible or easily accessible. The ocean floor is not the end of the living world, but a transition to a different form of it, one that operates under a different set of principles. In this context, the concept of life shifts from one of activity and interaction to one of persistence and stability. The organisms that inhabit these environments are not competing for resources in the way that surface organisms do. They are not responding to rapid changes or adapting to fluctuating conditions. Instead, they exist within a narrow range of parameters that remain relatively constant over long periods. Yet their survival depends on maintaining that balance, on functioning within the limits imposed by their environment without exceeding them. This form of life is not immediately apparent when considering the broad patterns of the ocean, but it is an integral part of the system. It represents a layer that is often overlooked, not because it is insignificant, but because it does not conform to the expectations that define more visible forms of life. It operates in silence, without movement, without the signals that typically indicate biological activity, and yet it persists, sustained by processes that are as fundamental as those that support life in any other environment. As the descent reaches its deepest and most hidden layers, this presence beneath the seafloor reinforces the idea that life is not confined to the spaces where it is most easily observed. It extends into environments that challenge our understanding of its limits, existing in forms that are defined not by abundance or interaction, but by the ability to persist under conditions that leave little room for anything more. As life extends beneath the seafloor, slowing to a pace that challenges even the idea of activity, the descent reaches a point where the question is no longer just how life survives, but what life actually is when stripped of everything we usually associate with it. Throughout the journey, each layer has removed something familiar. First light disappears, then movement slows, structure softens, energy becomes scarce, and eventually even the idea of an ecosystem begins to dissolve. What remains is not a single answer, but a pattern, one that suggests life is far more flexible than our initial assumptions allow. Near the surface, life is often defined by activity, by constant motion, growth, interaction, and competition. It is visible, dynamic, and relatively easy to interpret because it operates within conditions that align with human experience. But the deeper the environment becomes, the less those characteristics apply. Life does not disappear, but it changes in ways that make it harder to recognize. It becomes slower, quieter, less interactive, more dependent on internal stability than external opportunity. This shift forces a reconsideration of what defines a living system. If an organism can exist for years with almost no measurable activity, if it can survive on energy levels that approach the minimum required for chemical stability, if it can operate without interaction, without movement, without light, then the boundaries between life and non-life begin to blur in ways that are not immediately intuitive. The deep ocean does not just present extreme conditions, it presents alternative versions of life itself, forms that exist outside the frameworks that are typically used to describe biology. This has implications that extend beyond the ocean. When considering the possibility of life elsewhere, on other planets or moons, the assumptions often begin with conditions similar to those on Earth's surface: liquid water, moderate temperatures, access to light or other energy sources that can support active ecosystems. But the deep ocean demonstrates that these assumptions are not necessary. Life can exist without sunlight, without rapid energy cycles, without the kinds of interactions that define surface environments. It can persist in isolation, in darkness, under immense pressure, supported by chemical processes that are not immediately visible. This expands the range of environments that might be considered habitable, suggesting that life could exist in places that would otherwise be dismissed as too extreme or too inactive. The parallels to what might be considered alien environments are not hypothetical. The conditions found in deep-sea hydrothermal vents, for example, resemble those that may exist beneath the icy surfaces of moons, such as Europa or Enceladus, where subsurface oceans are thought to interact with rocky interiors, potentially creating similar chemical gradients. The microorganisms that inhabit sediments beneath the ocean floor demonstrate that life can persist within solid material, sustained by minimal energy inputs over geological timescales. These examples do not prove the existence of life elsewhere, but they redefine the criteria by which such life might be recognized. At the same time, the deep ocean reveals limitations, boundaries that cannot be crossed even with extensive adaptation. The absence of vertebrates beyond certain depths, the constraints imposed by pressure on molecular stability, the reliance on specific chemical conditions for survival, all indicate that while life is flexible, it is not without limits. These limits are not always where they're expected to be, and they are not defined by a single factor, but they exist, shaping the distribution and form of life in ways that reflect the interaction between biology and environment. This combination of flexibility and constraint creates a more nuanced understanding of life, is one that recognizes both its capacity to adapt and the boundaries within which that adaptation must occur. It also highlights the extent to which human perception is shaped by the conditions in which it evolved. The characteristics that are often associated with life, movement, growth, interaction, are not universal. They are specific to environments where energy is abundant and conditions are relatively stable. When those conditions change, the expression of life changes with them, becoming less visible, less active, and more difficult to interpret. The deep ocean, in this sense, acts as a reminder that what is familiar is not necessarily representative of what is possible. It challenges the assumption that life must conform to a particular set of traits, showing instead that it can take forms that are far removed from everyday experience. And it also underscores the limitations of observation. Much of what exists in these environments cannot be seen directly, not because it is hidden intentionally, but because it operates at scales and speeds that are not easily detected. Understanding these systems requires indirect methods, inference, and a willingness to consider possibilities that do not align with immediate perception. As the descent reaches its conceptual conclusion, what emerges is not a single narrative, but a framework for thinking about life that extends beyond the ocean itself. It is a perspective that recognizes the diversity of conditions under which life can exist, the range of strategies it can employ, and the limits that define its boundaries. It is also a recognition that much of what exists remains outside direct observation, not because it is inaccessible, but because it does not conform to the ways in which we are accustomed to perceiving it. If the descent is followed all the way to its deepest point, not just physically but conceptually, what remains is not a sense of distance from the surface, but a shift in how that surface is understood. The journey downward removes assumptions one by one, not by contradicting them directly, but by showing that they are not universal. Light, movement, abundance, interaction, all of these begin as defining features of life as it is commonly experienced, and gradually lose their relevance as depth increases. By the time the lowest layers are reached, the idea of returning upward is not simply a reversal of direction, but a reintroduction of conditions that now appear specific rather than fundamental. The surface does not represent the default state of life. It is one version of it, shaped by a particular set of environmental factors that are not present everywhere. As the perspective shifts upward again, the layers that were previously understood as stages of descent begin to take on a different meaning. The darkness that once seemed like an absence becomes a condition that supports entirely functional systems of light, generated internally rather than received externally. The scarcity that appeared limiting reveals itself as a force that drives efficiency, shaping organisms that waste nothing and rely on precision rather than excess. The pressure that seemed destructive becomes a defining parameter, one that structures life at every level, from molecular interactions to overall form. Each of these elements, when viewed in isolation from surface expectations, is not unusual. It is consistent within its own context. What made it seem unfamiliar was the comparison to a different set of conditions, one that is not present in the majority of the ocean's volume. As the ascent continues, The transition through these layers highlights how gradual the changes actually are. There is no clear boundary where one system ends and another begins, no distinct line separating what is considered normal from what is considered extreme. Instead, there is a continuous variation, where each depth introduces slight adjustments that accumulate over distance. The creatures that inhabit these layers do not experience them as abrupt shifts. Their biology is aligned with the conditions they encounter, evolving in response to changes that occur over timescales far beyond immediate perception. What appears as a dramatic contrast from a human perspective is, in practice, a series of incremental adaptations that together produce a wide range of forms and behaviours. This continuity challenges the idea that the deep ocean is fundamentally different in a categorical sense. It is not a separate world in the way it is often described. It is part of the same system, connected through physical processes, energy flows, and the movement of matter. The differences that emerge are the result of variations in those processes, not a complete departure from them. The organisms that live at different depths are not isolated from each other in an absolute sense. They are linked through migration, through the transfer of energy, through the shared structure of the ocean itself. What changes is not the existence of these connections, but the way they are expressed. Returning toward the surface, the reappearance of light, the increase in temperature, and the greater availability of energy begin to restore conditions that support more active forms of life. Movement becomes more frequent, interactions more continuous, and the pace of biological processes accelerates. But these changes are no longer interpreted as a return to normal. They are understood as a shift into a different set of parameters, one that supports a different range of possibilities. The surface, with its visible abundance and constant activity, becomes one end of a spectrum rather than its centre. This reframing extends beyond the physical characteristics of the ocean to the way it is perceived more broadly. The term strange is often applied to deep sea life, suggesting that it deviates from a standard that is implicitly defined by surface conditions. But if the majority of the ocean exists in darkness, under high pressure, with limited energy, then those conditions are not the exception. They are the dominant state. From that perspective, it is the surface that becomes the specialized environment, shaped by access to sunlight and the energy it provides. The forms of life that exist there are adapted to those conditions, just as deep-sea organisms are adapted to theirs. The difference lies not in which is normal, but in which is more familiar. This shift in perspective does not diminish the uniqueness of the deep ocean, but it changes how that uniqueness is interpreted. It is not a place where life behaves in ways that are inherently unusual. It is a place where life follows the same underlying principles under different constraints. The adaptations that emerge are not arbitrary. They are consistent responses to the conditions that define each layer. What appears alien is often the result of applying expectations that are specific to a different environment. By removing those expectations, the patterns that remain are recognizable, even if their expressions are unfamiliar. As the ascent completes, the surface comes back into view not as a point of origin, but as part of a larger system that extends far beyond immediate perception. The descent has not revealed a separate world, but a broader context, one in which life exists across a range of conditions that are more varied than they initially appear. The ocean, in its entirety, is not defined by a single set of characteristics, but by the relationships between its layers, the transitions that connect them, and the organisms that move within and between them. The idea that the deeper you go, the stranger life becomes reflects a perspective shaped by distance from familiarity. But when that distance is accounted for, when each layer is understood on its own terms, the pattern that emerges is not one of increasing strangeness, but of consistent adaptation to changing conditions. The ocean does not become more unusual as depth increases. It becomes less aligned with surface expectations, and in that difference, it reveals not just the diversity of life, but the limitations of the frameworks used to understand it.